Welcome to Free Radical Radio. This is Bellamy, and in the studio with me is Lawrence Jarach. Lawrence, well known for his editorship of Anarchy, a Journal of Desire Armed, as well as a number of essays. Thanks for joining us.
Sure. Happy to be here.
And Lawrence is taking some form of virginity for us, because for the very first time we are in a studio. The studio actually happened after weeks and weeks and weeks of saying, hey, we're building this studio, it's happening. Well, the rapture has arrived at last, and here we are. There's still some soundproofing to be done, but we have real microphones, we have a real tech person, we've got Rev, and it will only get better from here, so they say.
Onward and upward.
Onward and upward. The arc of progress is long, but it bends toward Free Radical Radio getting a studio. So, Lawrence, variously throughout your work, you've commented on the persistence, some might say at certain moments resurgence, of leftist and social democratic values among those who call themselves anarchists. We've seen it with anti-oppression practice and its excesses. We've seen it with the racial essentialism that goes along with that, support for third world nationalism, social work or legislative activism among anarchists, and even one of our favorite things that we talk about, attempts to stand in front of the police really closely and somehow shame them during protests. And you've noted how that's at odds with anarchist history in the U.S. and elsewhere. And you also mentioned to me before the interview that you've been an anarchist in the Bay since 1983. So why do you think the anarchist culture in the Bay Area, or in the U.S. more broadly, or correct me if I'm wrong, maybe internationally, has persisted in this way, or even at moments there have been resurgences of it?
Well, I think my experiences have been only in the United States, so I can't really speak to elsewhere.
Sure.
I know that in France, the folks that I've spoken to and hung out with, as well as in Germany, when I've hung out with some anti-fascist folks, the political spectrum in Europe is substantially different from the American. Also, well, primarily because there is a history of socialism in various parts of the electoral system in Europe where there is none here, despite what Fox News folks say. So the lack of an actual socialist political public praxis in the United States means that most of the folks who are attracted to that wind up being attracted more toward anarchist activism or anti-authoritarian activism. So you get a lot of folks who are into, or not into, but whose practical application of their politics is one of peaceful legal reformism, because that's not available in an electoral setting in the United States. It has to be in a street activist setting. Mm-hmm. So that's their outlet. The mythology of the civil rights movement, the mythology of the anti-colonial movement post-World War II has it in the United States that peaceful legal reformism is effective, at least domestically. Internationally, you can take up arms and fight against colonial oppression, and there have been various successes in the third world because of that. In the United States, the mythology of the civil rights movement is that the successes of Martin Luther King Jr. and the civil rights legislation and lunch counter sit-ins is that civil disobedience gets the goods. This is useful mythology for people involved in statecraft because they were actually the ones who were the driving force behind civil rights. The Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act are legislation from Congress. When those became the laws of the land, they were enforced by federal muscle. Yeah. So the civil rights movement is actually a state-sponsored movement in the United States, regardless of how much grassroots activism was involved in it. Primarily, the gains of the civil rights movement were granted by the federal government. Without acknowledging that as the actual history, it's very easy to get moved emotionally and even spiritually by pacifist activism, civil disobedience. It makes you feel righteous. and nothing better than feeling smug in the face of oppression.
Yeah, what we talked about on the show was that this whole act just around here with the recent protests where you see people really are drawn to facing off with the police, and there's this kind of personal catharsis that happens where the moral lines are almost literally drawn. You have a line of police, you have a line of people, and they're shouting, they're chanting. And
or they're sitting down and allowing themselves to be arrested.
Yeah, well, I didn't see so much of that happening recently here, but you do see at least the kind of waiting that allows for a kettle to form because of this. And it really is so revealing of how deeply the symbolic thought has entered people, where you're just looking for the ceremony. You're just looking to be able to go home and say, hey, I did something.
Mm-hmm. Well, especially if it winds up on TV.
Yeah.
This is something that I encountered in the 80s in the anti-nuclear movement in the Bay Area, was that people's gauging of their effectiveness was how much news coverage they received in the mainstream. So this also is part of the mythology of social activism, social justice activism. Is if the state or if the media are paying attention to you, you're actually doing something. The metric of effectiveness is what your enemies bestow upon you. In the same way that I've been in arguments in print and in personal correspondence with people who say, well, if you were more effective, the police would be paying more attention to you, and you'd be on the receiving end of billy clubs and arrest and jail time. And that's a really weird way of defining your effectiveness. Like, I don't know what effectiveness is. I don't know that you can quantify that. It's usually something that you can gauge after the fact. That's what history is written with in mind. Like, what were the antecedents of this pivotal event? Like, people who are involved in the pivotal event don't usually understand it as a pivotal event. It's only after. And you can look back and say, oh, well, here's the things that led up to it. Here's what the response was by the forces of law and order. Here's what occurred after. Like right now, I feel like after the fact analysis of some of the activism against police brutality and police murder, you can start to look at what the effectiveness is. Like, I'm kind of disappointed that the momentum of that has waned, not just because of bad weather, but also because of the lack of result. Right? That's one of the
locally or nationally?
Nationally as well. I mean, I know that there are still demonstrations going on the East Coast, in Missouri. I know those exist, but you have to really look for them, and you're not going to find them in the mainstream media reports. You got to look at alternative stuff. You got to look at small grassroots outlets that are actually covering the things that are not spectacular. So the stuff that's not rioting, the stuff that's not looting, the stuff that does still interrupt the smooth flow of capital, which is totally awesome. Those things aren't getting reported on. But I think those are the ones that are most effective, and those are the ones that may be more frightening to not the police, but to the folks who are in charge of the economic system that exists here. Like when Highway 24 was shut down 2 months ago, whenever that was, you had like 7-8 police agencies working on clearing like 200 people off the freeway. That's a lot of manpower from law enforcement to keep the smooth commute going. Like, there's something that police agencies understand about human traffic. Not human trafficking, different thing. Human traffic, like commute traffic, people getting to and from work. That's why the BART shut down by the Black Friday folks was really good. Like, yeah, you're inconveniencing a bunch of commuters, and you're also stopping the flow of capital. And I think police agencies, especially the upper echelons of the police agencies, know that that's really what is not good. We have to keep BART running. We have to keep the commuters commuting.
Keep people shopping.
Yeah. Keep people commuting, keep people shopping, earning money so that they can consume. Yeah. Like, this is the cycle of capital, and that's what the police are there to protect. So that when streets are shut down, when highways are shut down, when public transport is shut down, they get really nervous. In a different way that they did when Occupy was happening. Like, Occupy was happening, that was a different kind of activism. That was more like people getting together outside of the flow of capital. Mm-hmm. So that made them nervous for a different reason. But again, it's really twisted logic to decide that your enemies are the ones who gauge your effectiveness. Like, I'm much more interested in figuring out how we as individuals and as small groups and as larger federations of groups, however you want to organize ourselves, how we interact with each other on an ad hoc, on a recurring, on a counter-institutional basis, if you will. That's much more interesting to me than figuring out, oh, well, we didn't make the news, so we must not be effective. That's not how I gauge effectiveness.
Yeah, this is an accidentally perfect segue, because some of the conversations I've been trying to have with people involved in LBC, for instance, is what does it mean to do a media project if you're coming at things from a post-left analysis? And I guess effectiveness is a good way to put it. What if having that kind of analysis means you're really skeptical or even hostile to the ideas of mass society, ideology, mass communication? What does it mean to do a media project? How is that moving us toward the world that we would like to see? How do you conceive of producing AJODA? What is the kind of desired effect if you're trying to navigate that tension between putting the ideas out there, on the one hand, having people have the kinds of conversations that you want to have with people, and then on the other hand, knowing that generally the kind of way that mass media is used leads to some kind of mass movement, mass society that you don't want to see?
Well, partly we're lucky at the magazine because we don't have a huge subscriber base. Mm-hmm. So we don't wind up throwing thousands of copies out into the world. Mm-hmm. So we avoid that problem by sabotaging our effectiveness. Mm-hmm. In capitalist terms. But it does bring up the important issue, like how do we as producers of print media, in this particular case, how do we gain a readership? How do we get people interested in what we're doing to the point where they are having conversations with us? And there's a tension not just between getting the information out there, but getting the information out in a way that is compelling, in a way that's attractive. One of the ways that we try to do that at the magazine is to have visually striking graphics.
Very pretty magazine.
Yeah, I mean, I love the way it looks. Like, even if the content was subpar, for me as a reader, it's like I would just really like looking at it.
Yeah.
It's just produced so beautifully, and big props to Everhart Press for making it as beautiful as it is. The tension is a tough one. Before I was involved in producing the magazine, I would submit essays to various publications, English language publications. Most of the time I didn't get printed. And I felt frustrated by that because I thought what I had to say was really neat and interesting. And I found out later that actually it wasn't that neat and interesting because other people had been saying it better for years before I got around to figuring it out in my puny little brain. Part of that understanding comes from being more familiar with the theoretical literature and the projects that people are involved in already. So it made me much more hungry to find other anarchists who were involved in print media. That was in the days before the internet existed, so we didn't have social media sites, we didn't have email, we had to rely on snail mail, as they call it now. Finding places where anarchists actually hung out with each other and met, did projects together. So it was frustrating, but also exciting, because if you found one or two people around the country or even internationally who shared most of your ideas, it was thrilling.
Yeah.
And now you go to an anarchist meeting in the Bay Area and there's like 200 people there.
Yeah, but a lot of them don't share your ideas.
That's certainly true, and it's exciting sometimes to find out where the parallels are, where the overlaps are, and where the divergences are. And back to your question before, like the resurgence or the more public face of social democracy in action with a circle A slapped on top of it is in that room of 200 people. Mm-hmm. There might be 20% who share a skepticism of mass-based culture,
right?
Who share a skepticism of
revolution.
Yeah, union activism, revolution in the sense of a change in leadership.
Right. Like
this is something that is a constant issue for me, not just as a writer and an editor, but actually as a human being. Is when people use the same words to describe different things. Mm-hmm. So when I say revolution, I don't mean the same thing as when a Maoist says revolution. Mm-hmm. Even though we're talking the same language and we're using the same vocabulary, the intention behind it is very different. And this is something that's also confusing to a lot of folks who are just coming into anarchism or who've been in anarchism for a while and don't know the history, don't know the philosophy. Is there's a lot of analytical overlap between leftism and anarchism. And because a lot of the vocabulary winds up being the same from that analytical perspective, there are a lot of anarchists who think, oh, well, we're just the left of the left, mm-hmm. right? We're the radical conscience of the left, mm-hmm. as I think Kropotkin talked about it in those terms. But if you delve a little bit more into the actual theory, into the actual history, into the practice of social democracy, Leninism, Maoism, you look at what they've actually done in the name of revolution, in the name of Marxism, in the name of liberation, whatever fancy terms are thrown on top of it. And from an anarchist perspective, from a relentlessly anti-capitalist, anti-statist perspective, this stuff doesn't look too nice. Mm-hmm. Especially when people who are also anarchists in the places where leftists, social democrats, Leninists, Maoists have come into some kind of power, usually the anarchists don't fare that well. Nobody really likes anarchists, not even other anarchists, to be fair, to be accurate. So it's a strange position to be in, to try to make the ideas available, but not necessarily accessible. And by that, I don't mean, we at Anarchy Magazine would like to use a lot of big fancy words. Uh-huh. Like some of our authors do, and that's okay. Sometimes big words are okay, and they're not scary. Like I've had to run to the dictionary a bunch of times when I've looked at stuff that comes in and people want to publish something. Maybe we should change that a little bit, maybe, because like I had to go to the dictionary. But anyway, there's always going to be people who are smarter than I am, and that's cool. I appreciate that. But to make the ideas available, I think it's good to get ideas out. To do it in a way that is not a plug for recruitment. I think that's the crucial thing. Mm-hmm. It's like when we publish essays in the magazine, when we publish columns, reviews, even letters to the editor, like I'm less interested in how it plays out in, again, effectiveness. Like what is the effectiveness of a media project? Is it to get more people to subscribe? Is it to get more people to participate? Is it to get more people just to have conversations with outside of the print or internet or email realm, to have more personal conversations? Like that's more exciting for me. Mm-hmm. The issue of making it a mass recruitment drive, crowdsourcing, all of the stuff that's being used these days by various projects. It's weird. Like I don't want people just to throw money at the magazine. I mean, it would be nice to have, benefactors and sponsors aside from subscribers. That would be great. I wouldn't have to take it all out of my account. Mm-hmm. But I want people to feel like they have the ability to participate, not just consume. Mm-hmm. So that's tough. It's tough. You gotta do what, well, I can't say you. We have to do what we think is the best in terms of printing material that is provocative, that is thoughtful, that is intelligent, that isn't off-putting, that doesn't sound like some soapbox orator is writing. Even if the stuff is kind of fiery. Mm-hmm. Like in the next issue, we're only going to have one essay, but it's going to be really good. It's basically against identity politics.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's really good. I like it a lot.
Who's writing?
This guy, Lupus Dragon Owl. We published something from him a couple years ago on insurrectionism. Mm-hmm. It was a 2-part essay because it's really long. This one's long too, but I think it's worth having all in one issue. Mm-hmm. So it's going to piss people off, mm-hmm. and I think that's good.
Is that a measure of effectiveness? I'm just joking.
I'm that's one metric. Sure. I mean, I don't think you're joking. I mean, I hope you're not joking completely. I think that's good. It's like good comedy. Good comedy pisses people off too. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a measure of a certain kind of accuracy.
So I guess to try to digest some of what you're saying, one way of measuring effectiveness might be co-participation.
Yeah. I would hope so. Yeah.
Yeah.
Is not just
as compared to consumption and incorporation.
Yeah,
so
I mean,
might say on the one hand that the more propagandistic end is to more or less accept it and internalize it versus having a conversation with you or other readers.
I'd rather have the conversations.
Yeah.
I mean, it doesn't mean that I don't want to produce the magazine anymore. I do. It's stressful and sometimes it's a real drag, but I think the end result I think is totally worth it. Yeah, I'd much rather have people sit down and have chats, mm-hmm. Lively, subdued, hair tearing, like whatever, as long as there's some kind of engagement, mm-hmm. on an individual or small group basis.
So on the subject of media, maybe on the other end, and let me know if you think it is on the other end, you have these new efforts by Agency, and then we spoke to them about a week and a half ago, or a week ago, and then also Crime Think and to some degree some media, it's unclear to me how involved they are, putting out this To Change Everything mm-hmm. publication, and either together or one at a time, what do you think of those kinds of efforts?
Yeah, that's hard. It's hard to gauge, especially before
they're new.
Like these are just like 6-month-old projects, 7-month-old projects. It's hard to figure out what their effectiveness is going to be in terms of what their goals are. Like I looked at the Agency website, and on first glance, I really don't like what they're trying to do. Mm-hmm. I think that it's a misguided effort, mm-hmm. and but I'd love to be proved wrong. I like being proved wrong about a lot of stuff, but the notion that creating an accurate portrayal of anarchist politics and theory for mainstream media consumption seems really weird to me. because mainstream media is never going to like us.
Mm-hmm.
Whether the portrayals in them are accurate or inaccurate. Like, one thing that mainstream media has done starting maybe 6-7 years ago, which was interesting but not earth-shattering, was they stopped putting self-described in front of anarchist. It used to be absolutely necessary in every portrayal, in print and on TV and on the radio, to say self-described anarchist.
I wasn't aware of that.
Yeah.
In order to imply that it's some kind of nonsense.
Either that, or that these media pundits knew what real anarchism was.
Uh-huh.
So but there's always been that denigration, immediate denigration. Mm-hmm. Whether what they said afterwards was recognizable as I, as an anarchist who I'm familiar with anarchist history, recognize these people they're speaking about as anarchists, even through the filter of the mainstream media, which is always going to be hostile. I think that, again, I want to be proved wrong, and I want agency to be effective on their own terms. I'd like to see the Crime Think project of getting the ideas out into the mainstream to be effective. I don't know what that effectiveness looks like, but if it can generate some kind of interest among anyone to seek out more anarchist projects, more anarchist media, great. I'm skeptical, because the way that it looks like they're doing it is using the same kinds of propagandistic tools as the mainstream media uses. So public relations spin on anarchism, it seems internally contradictory to me. There's a reason why anarchism is a minority tendency. Mm-hmm. And it's usually because let me rephrase that. It's not usually because people just don't understand what we really stand for. Mm-hmm. Although mainstream education, mainstream media will always distort what we stand for because it's a threat. We don't like mainstream culture. Mm-hmm. So, of course, they're not going to say, oh, yeah, these anarchists are really cool. They're going to say, these anarchists are really dangerous. They are looters. Mm-hmm. They break windows.
Misanthropes. So.
Yeah, and then get into the whole primitivist thing, anti-civ thing. I think this actually plays into some of the social democratic tendencies among anarchists. There's a whole wing, if you will, of anarchist activists and anarchist theorists and anarchist writers who think that the main obstacle to normal people who haven't committed to a political tendency already, the main obstacle to them becoming anarchists is misinformation about anarchism.
Yeah, and some kind of underlying optimism that actually everyone, or 99% of people, are anarchists. They just don't know it yet.
Right.
And we were trying to get at that with them a bit and say, isn't this a kind of big tent approach where, to some degree, you're optimistically thinking, really, everyone believes this, and then on the other hand, you're also watering it down somewhat to make it more appealing? And they insisted really that they were not doing that, and that what they wanted was just to... At one point, one of them said, I want to live in a world with more anarchists. And,
ew.
And if...
I don't.
And if I only have 2 minutes to talk to someone, yes, I'm going to summarize things, but I don't think that summarizing things means diluting it. And I don't think that we're doing any kind of... There's no sort of malfeasance in the way that we're approaching things. And I wonder, one, what you think about this idea that really everyone's an anarchist, and two, whether... Maybe you could talk a bit more about what you were saying, where they're using some of the same propagandistic tools.
So let me try to answer that in two separate parts. The first part about not diluting the the message, even though you're trying to get it out to as many people as possible, and using short, pithy responses. I think there's a danger that that folks who are doing that, especially the agency, I don't want to pick on them, but I thought looking at their website that I just really didn't understand the point of being an anarchist PR firm. To get your message across in the mainstream media, you have to have like 10-second sound bites, and I don't think it does justice to the complexities and the nuances in anarchist theory. Even the broadest big tent anarchist theory. Like, what would that be in 10 seconds? We're against the state and we're against capitalism.
It doesn't give you a lot to go on.
Yeah, it really doesn't. I mean, you're relying on a particular vocabulary that you may share with other people, but the meaning of each of those vocabulary terms could be very different. And it is very different from person to person, from tendency to tendency. So when a Maoist says they're anti-capitalist, it means something different than when an anarchist says they're anti-capitalist, or when a libertarian Marxist says they're anti-capitalist. Like, what does capitalism then mean? So you're relying on people's assumptions about what you're saying, which I think does a tremendous disservice to any message that you might be able to get across in the mainstream. So that's one issue. The other issue, the idea that everyone's an anarchist and they just don't know it yet. I remember when CrimethInc had their short publication.
Which one?
Like, you may already be an anarchist.
Okay. Yeah.
So I gave that to my mom. She said, "Oh, I'm an anarchist." It's like, yeah, you know what? Everybody's a fucking anarchist if you give them that, because it's so broad and it's so generic, and it relies on an emotional sense of there's something wrong with the world. I can't quite put my finger on it. And the CrimethInc folks put their finger on it in a way that made it really not scary, and not threatening to the psychological well-being of any person with a conscience. On the one hand, I don't have a problem with that. It was really nice that my mom decided that she was an anarchist.
I finally understand you. So.
Yeah, she didn't, though. That's the thing. She still didn't understand me.
But she thought she did.
She thought she was closer to understanding. Great for her. And thanks, CrimethInc, for bringing my mom and me closer. I don't think everyone's an anarchist and just doesn't know it. I think most people aren't anarchists. Most people will never be anarchists, and that's okay. I quipped before that the agency and the CrimethInc, like, they want to live in a world with more anarchists. And I said, I don't. And so that comes to the distinction that I've made for more than 20 years between anarchy and anarchism. Like, anarchism is a particular political philosophy that comes out of 19th century Europe. It relies on Enlightenment thought. It relies on socialist thought. It relies on liberal thought. It is a Eurocentric way of understanding the world. Anarchy is the description of a condition of existence where there is no state, where there is no capital, where there are no institutionalized hierarchies. And that's why that's why I have to make I statements. That's why I look at human history. And for me, 99% of human history was anarchy. There were no institutionalized places where hierarchies could coalesce. There was no warfare in the sense that we know it in the modern sense. Yeah, it wasn't organized beyond a couple of hundred guys going out in the middle of a field and smashing each other's heads in. Like, that was warfare. Yeah, people got killed, people got maimed.
It wasn't nice.
It wasn't nice. That kind of way of conflict resolution is not nice. We can agree with that, right? But we're talking about the difference of scale and a difference of intent. So I'm not trying to paint the rosy picture of human prehistory. I'm not trying to say that gatherer-hunter societies are all hunky-dory. Like, I try not to make the same mistakes that I think John Zerzan makes when he talks about primal people, tribal people. Yeah, I have a degree in anthropology. Yes, I'm ashamed to admit, sometimes, depending on who I'm talking to. But that academic training also allowed me to be able to make a distinction between anarchy and anarchism. Like, in order for anarchy to exist, all that has to happen is for the state to disappear. People know what they're supposed to do with each other to figure out things. Like, anarchists are different from leftists in that, well, let me rephrase that. Some anarchists are different from most leftists in that we anarchists, some anarchists, are intelligent enough to recognize that people, in general, left to their own devices, will pretty much figure out what needs to be done and do it. This can be seen in historical examples. It's especially notable when natural disasters occur. Disease epidemics, hurricanes, like what happened after Katrina, like what happened after Sandy, what happened locally with the Loma Prieta quake, when the Cypress Freeway fell down. People from the neighborhood, which was, thanks a lot for your help, guys. We're going to now destroy your neighborhood when we rebuild the freeway. Folks from the neighborhood went to rescue people who were stuck on the Cypress Freeway that collapsed. Right? They didn't wait for the fire department to come. They didn't wait for CHP to get there. The same way that folks in New Orleans, when they recognized that FEMA wasn't going to come and help them, they had to start doing stuff for themselves. That's what solidarity mutual aid looks like. That's what those terms describe. Like, anarchists didn't invent this kind of way of interacting. Mm-hmm. We just gave it a name. Mm-hmm. Anarchists didn't invent the idea that people can get along without institutionalized hierarchies and without institutionalized violence. We just gave it a name. We gave it a name that made sense within a European context in the 19th and 20th centuries. That's what anarchism is. In order for anarchism to exist, you got to have a majority of anarchists. Mm-hmm. Most of the anarchists that I've dealt with over the last 30-odd years that I've been involved in this stuff, like, I don't want to live near them. I don't even like talking to them. It's not because they're anarchists that I find them annoying. It's because they're not my kind of anarchist. Uh-huh. So that's different. Like, I want to live with and around people I can get along with. And the less we have to talk about anarchism, the better off we'll all be. Because when you start talking about a philosophy and you decide that there's a particular way that things need to happen in order to be true to that philosophy, now you're going into the realm of ideology, where you have the ideas first, and then you try to make people behave on that game board inside those parameters.
Rather than starting from people's actually lived and experienced lives.
Yeah. And like having conversations.
Yeah.
Like, let's have a conversation about how we want to do X, Y, or Z. Mm-hmm. And my way of doing it would be in as cooperative a manner as possible, with the least division of labor possible, with people coming into it with a clear idea of their skill set. And here's what I can offer. Here's what another person can offer. Let's see what we can get out of the meshing of all of those things, starting with a conversation between individuals. And that's what the praxis looks like. It's not that we have to call it something. This is something that is very confusing to a lot of anarchists when we criticize a project or a tendency that exists outside of anarchism. Like when the Zapatistas came on the scene in 1994, like all these anarchists were saying, "Oh my God, look, there's anarchists running around in the jungles of South and Central Mexico because their practice looks like this. It looks non-hierarchical. It looks like the decisions come from the base to the top, even if they have a military formation. It looks like what we are familiar with. They go by consensus, or direct democracy. They have an armed wing, they have a non-armed wing. They're organizing at the grassroots. This is all awesome. And yeah, that's all awesome. It doesn't mean that it's anarchist. And when folks like me or Wolfie or some of the folks at Green Anarchy, all we did really was point out, look, American anarchists, these guys in Mexico are not anarchists. It's okay to support them. What they're doing on their own terms is non-hierarchical. It takes place outside of the realm of the state. It takes place mostly in opposition to international capitalism. All awesome stuff. But it's a mistake to call it anarchist, just because you recognize certain practices that they're doing. Anarchists did not invent this stuff. So just because people are doing it, it's not right to call it anarchist. When the piqueteros were doing their stuff in Buenos Aires, in Argentina, there was this, they had to come up with a new word to describe what they were doing. They call it horizontalism.
Right.
Awesome. It's horizontal. Great. Anarchists recognize that. We see that's a really good way of organizing. That's what we've been talking about for the last 150, almost 200 years now. That doesn't mean that they're anarchists. It means they're engaged in a project that is horizontal. Nothing wrong with that. But to turn them into anarchists so that we can say now we can express anarchist solidarity with them, that's a line that I think shouldn't be crossed. Mm-hmm. And if you explain, here's another annoying thing about American anarchists is that they think they have to explain what other people are doing to them. Mm-hmm. No, not what other people are doing to them. They need to explain to other people what they are doing in the terms that the American anarchists decide upon. That's colonialism. That's not cool. And that's why people are leery of especially white anarchists, because white anarchists have a tendency to do that. They have a tendency to say, I know what's really going on because I have a more sophisticated philosophical understanding of the world. Let me tell you what that is. That's when it starts getting into propaganda. That's when it starts getting into creating an ideological framework for what other people are doing. And I don't want it to be the case, but I have a feeling that's what Agency and the latest project from CrimethInc are trying to do with making stuff more accessible, or trying to bring anarchism to everybody. Mm-hmm. I don't want to bring anarchism to everybody. I don't even want to, anarchism is not something that I find compelling or interesting if it means all the stuff that I was just talking about.
Right. So you made that distinction between anarchism and anarchy, and we might even say that those people for 99% of human history were not anarchists, right? Because they weren't promulgating any kind of ideology and they weren't bringing that kind of philosophical understanding. We might just say they were anarchs.
Sure, or anarchic. They were living anarchically.
Yeah.
Sure.
And so that's a main tenet of the anti-civ position, anti-civilization position. And I mentioned to you beforehand I wanted to talk about your Why I Am Not Anti-Primitivist essay that you wrote, I think, 2008?
7?
7?
8? I don't know. It all blends together. Just arbitrary calendar stuff.
Crash of images that never stops, and then eventually does. So, yeah, it seems, in spite of having been around for some years now, arguably starting with the kind of the Freddie Perlman against his story against Leviathan, that the anti-Civ position is always saddled with these same albatrosses and can't really seem to get free of them. I at least encounter them regularly when I try to talk about these ideas, and that's, of course, you're unrealistic, this is impractical, how could we stop the globalized economy now that everything's so interdependent? How could we stop agriculture now that we have 7 billion people on this planet? And it sometimes even crosses over from just being called unrealistic to being called romantic or misanthropic, because you're saying you want all these people to die, or even kind of quasi-religious and apocalyptic in that you are imagining maybe some anti-Civ people definitely do say that we need some kind of collapse, or the collapse is going to happen. And so can you talk a bit about your responses in that piece, and maybe any responses that you've thought of since then, and how, is it possible to get free of these canards, or are we just going to be stuck with them?
I think we're stuck with them.
Mm-hmm.
The unexamined trajectory of Western civilization is one of constant progress and constant, or maybe not constant, but continual expansion of the mechanisms of social and economic control into more and more aspects of people's lives. We see that most notably in genetically modified
mm-hmm.
organisms, especially hybrid seeds that don't reproduce themselves.
Right.
So that there's a dependence on, for example, Monsanto, everybody's favorite whipping boy, to create seeds that farmers have to buy and then can't hold on to the seed stock because they won't grow unless you get the new batch of seeds. Then there's that scumbag from Nestle who says that drinking water is not a human right, but it's something that I can sell you. So the intrusion of that kind of stuff around basic issues, food, water, and shelter, it doesn't stop. It's like this. It's this juggernaut of economic. It's an economic stranglehold that they want to continue to have over the majority of people in the world. So that's a given. To call for an end to that, in whatever capacity people are capable of saying, stop, I refuse this, those people are always going to be called crazy. It's the same way that people nowadays, with the stuff around Ferguson and Staten Island, the refusal of grand juries to hand down indictments against killer cops, even when they're caught on videotape. The idea that it's unrealistic to abolish the police, for example. You can say it's unrealistic. And that's because the police have continually intruded more and more into people's lives, taking up more and more responsibility where 100 years ago, it would have been unthinkable for the police to be involved in a domestic dispute.
Mm-hmm.
Nowadays, it's unthinkable for them not to be involved in a domestic dispute. 100 years ago, it was unthinkable that a company would be able to sell seeds to farmers and the farmers would not be able to hold seeds for next year's harvest. That's unthinkable. Now, it's like, this is what we got. So the idea that it's unrealistic is going to be thrown at anybody who wants to change anything. So that one...
Well, that's what I think is funny, is that the non-anti-Civ radicals use the very similar vocabulary to talk about the anti-Civ position as is thrust at them from people who are less radical,
or for people who are supportive of the state,
of the mainstream.
Yeah, and so isn't it ironic?
Yeah,
I mean it's also painful to hear people who are self-described radicals, self-described anarchists, self-described revolutionaries say that we have to continue to rely on highly technological medical techniques and pharmaceuticals to keep people alive when they get sick. Like the logic of medical technology is totally built into the politics and the political economy of capitalism. You can't separate those things. Medical technologies don't exist in a vacuum. They exist as a result of militarism, of privatization of healthcare, of treatment for profit. Like, how do you not see that? Like, I don't get it. Like the focus of anarchist anti-primitivists on antibiotics is crazy
it's a
to me.
fetish.
Like, they've never heard of MRSA.
Mm-hmm.
They've never heard of
Tuberculosis.
Well, they might have heard of tuberculosis, but they think it's curable.
Well, I mean, multi-resistant.
Yeah, but like, what about the overprescription of antibiotics that has created resistant forms of infections?
Mm-hmm.
Like, now you got to get even more powerful antibiotics to cure the ones that you're not curing already, the ones that like this, the whole system is predicated on what I would call the ugly side of humanism. Humanism, the idea that human beings are the repository of all positive value in the universe. I don't know if not believing that makes me a misanthrope, but I don't believe that human beings are the pinnacle of creation.
The new divine.
Yeah. I don't believe that, like, if humans disappeared from the earth, I'm not sure that the earth would not be a better place. Maybe that makes me a misanthrope. I don't know.
Your goose stuff.
Yeah, like, saying that doesn't make me want to be a mass murderer.
Uh-huh.
It doesn't make me want to,
You're giving fuel to the millions will die.
Yeah, millions will die. Well,
Lawrence said.
I said this is what should happen. Like, that's this weird argument. Like, people die. People die of old age. People die from infectious disease. People die from car crashes. People die from on-the-job accidents. Like, one of the annoying things about the pushback by the police and the pro-police folks in the mainstream in the wake of the murder of Michael Brown and Eric Garner was that police are doing this hard job and they get killed on the job so often. Mm-hmm. And you know what? They're like number
less
10.
often than
They're like number 10 on the list of on the job deaths. It's miners, people in the lumber industry.
Yeah. I think lumber is actually the most dangerous.
Fishermen, people catching fish for fish eaters. Mm-hmm. Those people die more often than cops.
Mm-hmm.
But
what I always say is, if a lumberjack had a total meltdown and started chopping people in half, no one would be saying, "Well, their job's really dangerous and it's
a lot of stress." Yeah, they got to watch out for what they're doing. Maybe they need some retraining.
You like that chair you're sitting on?
Yeah,
lumberjack got you there.
Damn it. Yeah. So, people die. If the industrial, agricultural, global economy collapsed, like some of the apocalyptic messianic primitivists want, tomorrow, a lot of people would die. And you know where most of those people would die? Here.
Yeah, that's what's actually missed.
In industrial countries where people don't know how to take care of themselves, we're the ones who are going to die first.
Which is funny because often the argument is you saying you want collapse is racist or Eurocentric because we're going to be the best positioned.
No, we're actually in the worst position. The people who are more recently connected to their own land base are the ones who are going to survive a collapse. Yeah. Like, they know how to get water. They know how to grow food. We don't know jack. Mm-hmm. Yeah, maybe some of us have we volunteer at community gardens.
Yeah,
that's awesome. But you know what? That's
Well, usually those community gardens are dependent on the water system, fertilizer system, everything.
Yeah. So I don't know what to say to the anti-primitivist crowd that I haven't said already. Mm-hmm. Yeah, you guys are stupid. The arguments you use are bourgeois. They're mainstream. They're pro-capitalist. They're pro-state arguments. Why don't you understand that? It's the amount of material, the amount of topics that are off limits to anarchists from other anarchists is amazingly large. Mm-hmm. It's another reason why I don't like anarchists very much.
Mm-hmm. There's a kind of anarchist moralism that permeates most scenes, and there are taboos, and there are... Yeah.
And most of them are based on humanism.
Mm-hmm.
Humanism is a relic, like nationalism. These are relics of the 19th, 17th, 18th, 19th centuries.
Yeah.
They need to be jettisoned. Doesn't make me a romantic, by the way. I'm not looking at some glorious past that I want to relive. I'm looking to the future. Mm-hmm. And a future without humanism, a future without leftism, it's looking pretty good.
So then, the question that we've been asking a lot of people in recent interviews is, given that a lot of things are jettisoned from the post-left analysis, what does that leave the post-left praxis looking like? If you or we, however you want to put it, are skeptical of most anarchists even, or the idea of creating more anarchists through media projects, or the idea that we can hold on to even much of anything in this world, what does that leave one to do who's trying to lead a projectual life?
Yeah, that's the $1 million question right there. For me, it's interpersonal relationships. It's dealing with people in a way that's respectful, in a way that's not as non-hierarchical as possible, to interact with people in a way that is not so that I don't dominate and I am not dominated by anyone. Not easy.
So does that mean it's restricted to a kind of personal individual sphere?
I don't know if that's a restriction. Mm-hmm. I think that's the place to start. Mm-hmm. And to make that broaden into larger and larger concentric circles, if you will. Mm-hmm. The more people that you interact with, the more the ideas get out there. Not in 10-second sound bites, but in actual conversations, so that there's some meaning there. There's comprehension.
What would you say when you talk about things that way, it has a kind of pessimistic tone to it about, I guess, the possibility of a world that you would like to see happening even remotely in your lifetime or on any kind of scale. Is that true?
Yeah, I'm definitely a pessimist.
You're definitely a pessimist.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, that's one of the reasons why the queer nihilist tendency is just, it's thrilling to me. Uh-huh. I love reading that stuff.
Baden.
Yeah. It's really awesome to read. It fills me with as much joy as I can get while reading the printed word. Just the whole picture that is painted. The whole worldview that is presented in that perspective, I think, is really fun. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I'm a pessimist. Mm-hmm. I don't see any good stuff happening in my lifetime. Mm-hmm. We got a taste of it in Occupy Oakland. There was a taste of it, and it was unformed. It was ad hoc. It was experimental. It was destined not to last, but it changed a lot of people. It exploded people's perceptions of what's possible, and that was fun too. It was super frustrating, but it had moments of what I would consider tremendous clarity. Mm-hmm. And the conversations that happened down at the plaza were conversations that I never thought I would overhear or participate in my lifetime. So there's always
They're blips.
there's a spark there somewhere. There's going to be something like that at another time, in another place maybe. I may not be involved in it, and that's okay. But I caught a glimpse of what is possible.
Okay. Oh, okay. Okay. Do you want to talk about the next issue of AJODA?
Sure. Next issue will be coming out in late March, early April. As I mentioned, we've got the essay against identity politics. We've got some good book reviews. Our website is pretty dormant at this point because we don't really have anybody who's a web genius on board. So you can communicate with us just by sending an email to editor@anarchymag.org. And we're happy to have conversations with people on email and look forward to it. It should be I think it'll be a good looking magazine like it usually is. And we're going to try really hard not to raise the price, even though the Postal Service keeps killing us with postage. But it'll be available, and back issues are always available. We've got pamphlets. If people want to get the information, they can get the information. And we're not looking to propagandize or get recruits. We're looking for participants.
Thanks a lot for participating here.
All right, cool. Glad to be here, and good luck with the project.
Thank you.